Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas.
And we post a video every week, so why not subscribe and press the alert button so you can keep up with our adventures.
And daring do. And if you've got a burning horticultural question from Mr. Ryan, put it in the comments below and he will answer them in 60 seconds in our Monday Shorts.
And don't forget to tell me where you're from for context.
Absolutely. But Stephen, we're in a very beautiful, very considered landscape today, but if we're talking about that tree, it's going to be a very short show.
Yes, this is a very minimalist landscape we're standing in, but we're not looking particularly at this landscape. We're looking at one that's part of this property.
It is an amazing garden. And as a sidebar, this garden's going to be open on the 17th of February. So we'll put the links below, 2024, if you happen to be in time to watch it. But Stephen, what are we really here to see then?
Right, we're here to see what you could almost consider, if it had walls around it, a walled garden, because it's going to be a completely separate garden from the house and surrounds. So it's an isolated garden.
Interesting, and we're very fortunate to have the garden designer to talk to, Michael McCoy. Michael is the host of a TV program and has a series of books called Dream Gardens, and we'll put the details of those below. So we're very fortunate to have him here today.
Well, why don't we go have a talk to him?
Okay, let's go.
All right, here we are, and we're with an old friend of mine, Michael McCoy, who's going to give us all the information we need so that we can understand this garden.
Hello, Michael. Great to meet you.
You too, Matthew.
Thanks for having us.
Oh,
Yes.
It's fantastic you could come.
Yes, well, it's one of those things that has just sort of happened, really. So we're in a garden that is going to be open to the public in late February or mid-February, so February the 17th. If anybody happens to be nearby, they could come and have a look at this garden so they can see if what we're talking about really is, in fact, how it works.
Is it a dream garden?
Yes, well, is it a dream garden, in fact? And so, Michael, I guess first off, I'd like to know a little bit about the scope and scale of this garden and when it started.
So it started in 2011. The clients had just bought the property and there was not really a house on site. There were lots of sheds and a whole lot of interruptions to this landscape that now looks kind of beautifully clear and obvious, but it wasn't at all at the time.
And what was your first response when you saw the site?
Oh, well, let's just say I didn't see what the client did in terms of potential.
Yeah.
And that's a very humbling thing, because as a designer, you like to be the one that walks in going, oh, really?
Yeah,
That's
yes.
me.
I see it.
Yeah.
Yes, I can do
No,
this.
they saw it, and I was just going, oh man, how are we going to manage this? I wasn't aware of how good the view is. You know, the view is so extraordinary.
It is amazing. So am I clear then that there was like vegetation in the way? You literally couldn't see it because there was so much stuff here.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was sheds and vegetation, and there was lots of firewood, and yeah.
I guess the other thing then that strikes me is just the house and its relationship to the site. So what was the initial brief?
Well, the clients came to me with books of Pete Adolf and
Our Prairie Friend.
Yes, Our Prairie Friend, and also of James Van Sweden and Wolfgang Irma. So they really wanted a very perennially floral kind of garden. But their vision of the house was of something a whole lot more austere than that. And so they didn't take much convincing to say, like, we need to separate these two and have the house sitting in isolation, in fairly glorious isolation. Really.
It certainly is. There's almost no greenery other than lawn.
That's right,
Yeah.
exactly. And virtually no interruption at all to make it feel like the house is almost unaware of, or that the landscape is not built in any way to respond to the house. And then to create this medallion, I guess, or this isolated garden that could be its own thing without having to relate to the bigger scale. Because that's the other thing. You're looking, I don't know, maybe hundreds of kilometres out there, I'm not sure.
It is a vast landscape.
Yeah.
So that in order to create a perennial garden that had any relevance in that setting, it would have had to have been possibly 10 acres.
Yeah.
And no one realistically thought that was worthwhile.
Well, you need a lot of staff if you're going to look after Versailles.
And plants.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So this behind us was about a quarter acre, or at least it's approximately 50 metre circle of isolated space, just visible from the house, but only enticingly so.
And how did you come to that conclusion that you were going to sort of isolate the cultured garden to this bit?
Well, I knew that what we needed to find was something that stood alone, that had relevance, that was somewhat introspection. And of course, everything around here is outward looking to the south and the north.
Yeah.
And I was looking at Google Maps and looking at some aerial photos and went, oh, it looks to me like there's kind of an open circle partway up the driveway.
Right.
I must dash up. This is one of the great things. I mean, you don't really want local clients because you don't want to run into your clients in the supermarket.
That's right. It can be a bit awkward.
But the one good thing about that is that you can jump in the car and dash up here and have a look at what you're thinking.
Right.
So I stepped out of the car and went, oh, this is perfect. There's this sort of circle of trees with virtually no interruptions in the middle that had enough of a sense of containment to be a standalone garden.
So, Michael, you had this open space, so you decided where the garden's going to go, but it was just a general sort of open area. So how did you, in fact, decide on, and what did you do to get the levels and the changes to this garden that will make it more interesting?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things with this kind of planting is that it's too easy. You just get obsessed with the plants and you end up with paths running through planting and nothing else. And I wanted to have opening and closings in there. But the other thing is that the soil here is incredibly shallow. The rock is, I can see rocks sticking up.
Yes, there's rocks sticking up through the grass.
And so what we knew is that we were going to have to put this, whatever soil we were planting into, would have to go on top of this. We couldn't excavate.
No.
It so happened that out on the roadside there was this mountain of soil that had been scraped off the top of the road over years and years and years. And we brought this in, and actually we didn't need it to have high nutritional values. We just needed to have it well drained, and it was.
Yeah.
And so we created basically 3 terraces joined up with paths that allowed 3 pools of gravel with paths running between them. And then all of the slope is just absorbed in the planting.
Interesting. Now, this is a recurring theme, Stephen.
Yes.
Finding free piles of soil. We've talked to a few people, like Lyle at Rorama, who...
Yeah, well, he got it by the 10-metre truckload.
Yeah.
Because when he was doing his garden, they were doing the freeway, and they just bought all of the clean fill in off the
mixed
freeway.
bag. I mean, there was tarmac, bricks,
Oh, there was all
clay.
sorts of
There
stuff
was
in.
tarmac in this.
Yeah.
Was there?
And weeds like crazy.
Yeah.
Once the planting started here, the client did all the planting, and the weeds just subsumed the plants to the point that I thought all was lost. I walked in one day and just went,
This is it.
It's a disaster.
And she was halfway through clearing the weeds out, so you had this perfectly clear, beautiful, isolated little plants in fresh soil, and then this just absolute forest of sorrel. And I just went, it's gone, it's lost. And she goes, what are you talking about? No, we'll make it. And sure enough, she never stopped.
So how long a cycle was that for those sort of exotic weeds to be eliminated? How long did it take for your planting to take control?
I reckon it would only have been in the first maybe 18 months to 2 years that it really looked, because they were so careful and so hardworking about it. So at that initial weeding, they then mulched, and they were really, really on top of it. I mean, it would still come back if, you know.
Yeah,
if
given
you
half
took
a
your hands
chance,
off the
it'll
wheel.
take over again. And of course, you're surrounded by paddocks and fields and things, so there's always the chance of new weedies or more weedy species coming in. Yeah, so they'll come in no matter what, so you do have to keep on top of things. Michael, there must have been, other than the soil, some other challenges.
And your initial reaction.
Yes, exactly, with this site, because every site has its challenges, so there must have been other things you had to look at and deal with.
Sure. Well, look, we were definitely working in a site that had very little water available. There were not a lot of tanks, etc., and we knew we had to be careful about that. As it turns out, the client has increased that capacity to some extent, so that's not such a bad thing. But I designed this garden with the intention of it not being watered.
So for our overseas viewers, put this climate in context in terms of sort of rainfall, highs and lows.
Okay.
I mean, temperature highs and lows.
Woodend nearest town is about 700 mil of rainfall a year. It's a bit less up here. It's a bit of a rain shadow as far as I understand.
Right.
We're on much rockier and free-draining soil, more free-draining soil than the mountain nearby with, good mountainous soils and deep mountain soils. Frost, we get light frosts that might burn a shrubby Mexican salvia a little. 5 kilometres away, shocking frost, but we're on top of a hill, so it's reasonably frost-free. And then summer temperatures of up to absolute maximum will be mid-40s, above the 40s a few times in a summer, but often in the 30s in summer.
I'll drop the Fahrenheit in. I can never remember from the top of my head. And this seems to me, well, we're kind of at the crest of a hill-ish. So is this quite exposed in terms of wind too?
It is very windy. And so I had designed a garden in my own hometown in Woodend, which is only a few k's away, with this similar plant range, and never watered it.
Right.
And that's what I intended would happen here. I didn't realise how much more demanding the windy site, the exposed windy site, was going to to be.
So do they water? What's the plan here now?
Maybe 3 or 4 times a year. They haven't watered it all this year.
It's been very wet.
Yeah. But it has been, it is remarkably drought tolerant.
Are there any temporary things that come and go, like rabbits, kangaroos,
Which are so common in the south of England and northeast USA.
Yeah.
you know, things that that you don't see day to day here, but that could
I
cause
just saw parrots over there.
There were rabbits on this site. There was a lot of rabbits on this site, and so they housed about 5 acres or so in 2 hectares ish in rabbit-proof fence.
All right.
Of course, in doing so, they housed some rabbits or imprisoned some rabbits.
Yes,
within
you
there,
had fun.
which they've never quite gotten entirely rid of, but they've really been able to manage it. But they did used to have a little rabbit-proof fence around the perennial garden. And I insisted about 5 years ago it had to go. I hated it. It was supposed to be a continuum. So that's gone. And as we approached today, you remember we saw a little rabbit scurrying through there, but they've pretty much managed to stay in control. But other than that, there really are there's no other scourges.
Well, Michael, thank you for allowing us into this wonderful site, and we're going to go for a little walk and have a look at some of the finer details.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your time. I can't wait to go and have a look.
Let's go.
Well, Stephen, it was great to meet Michael, the word of the designer.
Yes, it's always good to engage with somebody who actually designed something, because then you can understand where they were coming from. It helps a lot.
I've got a much better sense now. So we will show you the landscape where the house sits, because it is amazing. Yep. But I think what we should do now is take a tour about this garden and just look at some of those points Michael was talking about.
Yes, see how it all works.
Let's go. Well, Stephen, so let's take a turn about the shrubbery, as Miss Austin would have said. Tell me then some of the things you need to bear in mind if you're planning a garden like this.
All right, well, the design has to be such that you've got enough height in your borders to cut the areas up, because when you're using mainly perennial material, of course, you don't have that sort of like hedges and large shrubs and things that are within it.
Yeah.
So you need some very tall perennial material. So the ornamental grasses come into it and make a fabulous effect. You also need to look at textures and forms. So again, the grasses come into it. There's lots of verticality with some of these borders.
There is, yeah.
But then you've also got to have the other textural qualities. So you need sort of rounded or flattened or horizontal layers as well. And then, of course, it comes down to colour coordinating as well, because in these sort of gardens, it's not about just throwing everything in and hoping it's all going to work. You have to select a colour palette that you're going to work with. And in this garden, there's lots of blue, there's lots of rich pinks. Funnily enough, there's a fair slice of oranges at certain times of the year, but it has been limited in its colour range to a certain extent. So remember, texture, heights, and shapes and colour are the main things in a garden like this.
And I find it just a bit stressful thinking about the colour palette. Should you get, I mean, like hung up on it, or can you be a bit free and loose?
Look, I think that people who get completely hung up on colour palettes will always come a cropper.
Unstuck.
Yeah, because something will come up that's not quite the colour you expect.
Like the Sissinghurst White Garden, and a rogue pink thing arrives and everyone goes crazy and pulls it out.
Well, exactly. Or, you know, the Bodnant red borders that have a lot of orange in them, funnily enough. But there you go. So, yeah, colour you don't need to get quite so tied up with. In fact, I have a great belief in tones of colour being more important than the colour themselves. Right. So if you're using big, strong primary colours, that's fine, but then you don't want to whack a pastel in the middle of it. So there are those sorts of considerations to have, but yeah, you don't need to get too hung up.
And now, what about this? I've read this quite a bit about sort of colour choice, particularly in Australia. The idea that pastels and soft colours kind of don't really respond well on the Australian landscape because our light is so harsh and the sun's so strong. So strong colours, which this garden has, work better. What do you think about that?
Look, I have to say I agree with it to a large extent. But having said that, of course, you can have the cooler and pastel colours in a shadier, cooler aspect within the garden.
Right.
So you don't have to do without them.
Yeah.
But in general, if you're going to be planting a garden out in a fully exposed, open, sunny aspect, then you will find in our summers that the stronger colours will be more telling.
Right, right. All right. Well, I think on that note, we should actually stop and look at some of the particular plants Michael's used in this garden.
Oh, what a good idea. All right. Well, one of the things we've spoken about so far is getting a vertical sort of type of plant in the garden.
Who doesn't love a strong vertical season?
Exactly. And of course, ornamental grasses, many of them do that with aplomb. So there's lots of verticality in grasses, and yet they're soft and airy. They're not stiff and hard. So they give you the vertical, but they're not too obvious about it, if that makes any sense.
We have a mutual friend on Mount Macedon who has sworn you will never find a decorative grass or an ornamental grass in her garden.
Well, it takes all sorts. Some people with taste, some people without, and I won't say which is which.
All right, so I can see a couple of different types. So tell us, let's go through the grasses in this garden.
Yeah, all right. Well, this one is a well-known ornamental grass, Stipa gigantea, and it has a lot going for it. It's evergreen grass, so even in the winter, it's still got green foliage, so it's an evergreen grass. The foliage stays well away from the flowers, so the flowers sit well clear of it, and so the grass foliage doesn't mean much in the summer months, but it's there and it will smother other weeds and things. And the flower heads sit well above. So it sits up airy and light. It moves in every puff of air, which is another thing grasses do exceedingly well. I love movement in a garden. And this soft sort of beigey straw colour that the flower heads go almost from day one. They have a slight greenish tinge to start with, but then they go this strawy colour as they die, and they will sit there all winter.
I must say, it is a really nice counterpoint to the pink, isn't it?
It does.
This straw colour.
Yes, it really, well, it works with nearly anything. I mean, you can use these strawy, grassy plants in almost any colour combination because in a sense they're not, well, they are a colour, but they're not in the colour palette that you would normally use in a garden. So if you had strong hot colours, you can still use ornamental grasses amongst them. They work really well with soft pastels and softer shaded flowers as well. So the ornamental grasses can be a counterpoint in virtually any sort of garden style.
So this particular one, let's just say, where's it from and care?
All right, well, it comes from the drier parts of Europe, and it requires very little care. And the one thing I will say, though, of an ornamental evergreen grass, please don't cut them down like they've got a crew cut at any time. If you've got a lot of dead clobber inside, dead leaves and things, just put your hands in and rake the dead leaves out of it, because otherwise it takes an awful long time for that stubble to disappear amongst the new growth when it comes up later in the season.
Okay,
so
we're hearing you.
Yeah, so clean the dead flower spikes out by tugging and then go through and clean out the dead leaves, but please don't cut them down to the ground. I think it looks awful. So because it comes from dry parts of Europe, it's very drought tolerant. So it will grow very well in our climate with no added moisture at all.
And Michael was saying this particular garden is very rarely watered.
Yeah, so it goes through the whole summer usually without any help. So Stipa gigantea will do it very, very easily. It's of course cold hardy. You see it used in gardens in England and North America all over the place. So it's a very tough and hardy grass, easy.
Fabulous. All right, well, let's go and look at that fluffy one over there.
All right, let's go.
So this is the other one that immediately springs to eye. What is it?
Well, it's one of the Miscanthus sinensis varieties, so the Japanese feather grasses. I'm not quite sure which cultivar Michael has used, and there are lots of them.
You're forgiven.
So I don't necessarily, or I haven't necessarily kept up with the most current varieties that are available here, but they are great grasses because they have fabulous volume in a garden. They have great height, and in fact some might remember our video we did on my Miscanthus at home that I paint red in the winter.
The notorious Miscanthus Juluxia.
Yes, exactly. This is obviously a quite different species or different form of the species, and these will look at their best right through from about mid to late summer, right through virtually to the end of winter, when they'll then need to be cut right down to ground level as the new growth comes up. So they give you wonderful winter structure the whole time. And again, they're hardy. They're not as drought tolerant as something like the Stipa. A little bit of summer irrigation sometimes is necessary if the soil doesn't hold enough moisture. I find they can get a little stricken by drought, but they're fairly heat tolerant. They're certainly cold hardy because they disappear in the winter anyway. They are a group of grasses that can be grown in almost any garden climate other than probably the true tropics.
There you go.
All right, Matthew, here we have verticality taken almost to an extreme.
It's very vertical. It's
Yes.
beautiful.
Yeah, it's a lovely grass. Now, this is one of the Calamagrostises. It's a selection called Karl Foerster. And for verticality, it's really hard to beat. You get this strongly upright foliage, strongly upright flower spikes, and in a not too rich and wet spot where it can sometimes fall out, if it's kept a little mean, it will actually grow and stay very vertical, even right through the winter months. So you'll have this strawy coloured verticality all the way through until you have to cut it down towards the end of the season.
Now, is this evergreen or perennial?
No, this one's a herbaceous perennial, so all the foliage will die as the winter comes on. So come late winter, just before the new growth really gets itself started, so you'll need to keep an eye on it. It needs to be cut down as low as you can manage to go, so that you get rid of any stubble.
Now, all of these grasses we've looked at, weediness. So grass obviously has inherent problems.
Well, it can have, although people sometimes take these things to extremes. The Calamagrostis Karl Foerster is purportedly sterile. So it's a selected,
Karl.
so it's a selected form, but it's not a poor thing from a gardener's perspective, because you don't necessarily want a grass that's going to go nuts and self-seed itself all over the place. I mean, there's plenty of weedy grasses that do that anyway. Most of the Miscanthuses rarely self-seed in our climate, so although they're not mainly sterile, they don't seem to be particularly good at self-seeding. And you only very rarely see a Stipa gigantea come up from seed. So I don't quite know why, but it rarely self-seeds in this country.
In our Spanish garden story, what was that grass that was...
Oh, yes. Known generally as Stipa tenuissima, but is actually Nacella tenuissima now. That's the Mexican feathergrass. And yes, there was a huge kerfuffle about that in this country. It came into the country, it was being grown by a few growers, and those in the know decided that this was just not on and that it could become a major environmental weed. And so they stomped on it before it could sort of get a real hold in cultivation here.
The grass police.
Yes, exactly. So there you go.
Well, we've done the grasses. Let's look at some of the colour that's going on in
Oh
this
yes,
border.
because there's some really pretty perennials here.
Yes. So blue seems to feature a lot in the garden.
It's a good colour. It works well with the other colours that Michael's used in this garden. There's lots of good blue flowering things that flower in high summer when the garden's going to be used at its most, I guess. And of course, blue has this little bit of sort of cachet of being a most unusual colour in flowers.
Yes, the blue this, the blue that. Oh.
And in fact, a lot of the blue things that the nursery industry sell,
They're purple.
Purple,
Yeah.
or lilac,
Or
or
lilac,
mauve.
or mauve.
Yes, so the term blue is used rather loosely in some places, but one has to say that this Agapanthus gets pretty close to a true blue, and so it's definitely worthwhile including in the garden. People either absolutely adore or absolutely abhor Agapanthus, and I can see both sides of the story. I mean, in certain areas it's become quite weedy, although having said that, if you manage it in your garden and you take the flower heads off before it goes to seed, it can't go weedy. So it can be about a management issue. And of course, in some climates, it's not a weedy issue, so therefore, why not use them? I mean, they're high summer flowering. There are some wonderful blue forms out there. And this one is I think, one of the best selections of blue that we have here in Australia. And this is Agapanthus Guilfoyle. It was found in the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne as an unnamed clone. And I think David Glenn at Lambley Nursery at Ascot decided to give it a name, and he decided to call it Guilfoyle after William Guilfoyle, who was the second director of the Botanic Gardens.
And we've made a whole series of films in the Botanic Gardens, which we'll link below.
Yes, go in and have a look. It's a great place.
Now, give me a bit of the history. Where is Agapanthus from? It's South African, isn't it?
Yes, Agapanthus are all restricted mainly to southern parts of Africa. You see a lot of them growing in the Eastern Cape area. They tend to grow in areas where there is some summer rain, and yet, funnily enough, they're incredibly drought tolerant. In cold climates, there are a certain number of them that are properly herbaceous in the winter, and they're the best ones to grow in the colder climates. Guilfoyle is one of the evergreen Agapanthus, which will work well as a foliage plant for the winter here, as well as giving the fabulous rich blue flowers in the summer, but probably isn't as cold hardy in the colder climates like Europe and North America as some of the herbaceous ones. But I think Guilfoyle is a fantastic Agapanthus, and I'd like to see more of it being used in this country.
Okay. Now this caught my eye because for a significant birthday of mine, I went to Georgia, the country, not the state.
Yes.
And we went in late April, May, around my birthday. And of course it's wildflower time in Europe. And the Caucasus Mountains is one of those sort of botanic hotspots.
Oh, it is. It's amazing.
There I saw Verbascum growing wild, and it filled my heart with joy.
Yes. Well, they are remarkable looking plants. And again, a little bit like the Agapanthus we've mentioned, there are the lovers and the haters of Verbascums, because some Verbascums have become seriously weedy.
Yeah.
This particular one hasn't shown any great signs of being weedy in this climate. And it certainly gives wonderful verticality. And of course its beautiful silvery foliage is quite telling in a garden. And it does actually illustrate something interesting, because lots of people will tell you shouldn't mix pink and yellow in a garden. And yet this is working surprisingly well, I think.
Well, this is why we've stopped at this moment, because we've got 3 very distinct plants, and I think it looks beautiful. So what is this one? All
right, well, we've got the Echinaceas, of course, which are a very popular daisy-flowered perennial.
Yeah.
And this is one of the pink versions thereof. I'm not quite sure of the cultivar name, but anyhow, it's a very nice, compact, floriferous variety. And of course, we've got what has to be one of the great summer flowering perennials, a genus of plants known as Agastaches or Agastache. This particular one is an Australian selection. It was selected by the guys up at Antique Perennials at Kinglake.
People we are hopeful to make a video with.
Oh yes, we've been invited. We've just got to find the time to go to Kinglake. And this is a selection called Nadine. And I have to say, it's named after one of the guys' wives. And I think they did a very good job of naming an exceedingly good perennial after her. And it's really interesting because at a distance it looks very pink, but if you get up close, the flower buds have a distinctly orange colour to them. And again, pink and orange you don't sort of think of as working together, but in this Agastache it works exceedingly well.
And the smell, the leaves.
Yes, it's got a nice herby smell about the foliage.
Almost a lemon verbena.
Yeah, so
fragrance.
Obviously, because it has good scented foliage, don't plant it too far back in a border, because part of the fun is running your hands over it and having a little sniff as you walk past. So
and
I think
now,
that's lovely.
All of these things, is the Verbascum a biennial or is it a perennial?
Yeah, the Verbascum is a biennial, so that plant that's in full bloom now will die after flowering, shed its seed, and it will just have the corpse removed from the garden.
The Echinacea?
The Echinaceas are perennial, although sometimes not overly long-lived perennials, so you sometimes have to replant.
And Agastache?
And the Agastache is a tough, fairly long-term perennial, so it can be a quite permanent part of the border.
And I'm presuming, obviously in this garden, they're all relatively drought tolerant, but what about hardiness?
Cold hardiness, they'll all go to very low levels. So in most parts of North America and Britain, they should be fine. Again, they're not plants for the tropical climes, though. They hate that high humidity in summer. So in the more Mediterranean climates, you should be able to grow those plants almost anywhere.
Excellent. On to the next.
Well, while we're here in this garden, I've noticed something of interest that often comes into my nursery as a sample and people want to know about it. And this Echinacea has a greening virus, and there's quite a bit of it through this patch here. The virus actually turns all of the petals into green pigmented petals, and often it starts producing funny little plantlets inside the flower heads. So it completely mucks up the gene pool, chromosomes, whatever of the plant. Now, it's not restricted to daisies. It can show up in lots of things. And in fact, I've also found a digitalis here with the greening virus in it. There's no cure for it, so you can't fix a plant that's got this greening virus, but it is probably a really good idea to remove any plants that show signs of it, because it can slowly spread through a whole colony of related plants. So dig them out and discard them as you find them.
Oh, Stephen, it's time to rest our weary limbs.
Yes, and that's another thing with any garden, and this one actually shows that people are thinking things through. To walk through a garden is one thing, but to have somewhere to sit, relax, cogitate.
Who doesn't love to cogitate?
Yeah, exactly, is also important. So they've got a lovely big broad area of gravel here, so you've got somewhere dry to put your feet, and you're surrounded by the border as well. And I have to say, it does make for an interesting experience.
Now, it's interesting because, as Michael said, this land was on a slope and they've hard landscaped it a bit. So there are kind of vales and dells. So the whole garden isn't revealed to you. And this little seating area isn't, which
No.
reminds me when we walked through Dreamthorpe, through that curved perennial border, that
Exactly.
you came upon the sitting area kind of by chance.
Yes, it's sort of there. It's obviously purposeful, but you don't. It's sort of not like at the end of a vista where it
No.
becomes the feature. It's just an incident as you wander around.
But Stephen, is there a purpose to this languid self?
Well, apart from sitting here relaxing for a change instead of running around filming, there is a plant here that Michael, in our initial walk around the garden, pointed out to me, and he sees it as being problematic. It's a Phlomis, and there's one still in flower behind me here, Phlomis tuberosa, and it actually gets an edible tuber under it for any of you who are struggling with the current economical situation.
We could eat our way through.
Yeah,
this
we could
border.
eat our way through the thing. Now, the problems Michael came up with this plant, which is sort of obvious when you think about it, it mainly goes into its declined sculptural dead look, which is fabulous during the winter, but it does it rather early. So it does it far too early in the early summer when everything else is looking verdant and flowering and full of life. This Phlomis is already starting to go into its winter look.
And we're filming in midsummer, and everything, as you said, is at its peak. Some things have moved on, but this is dead.
Yeah, and this sort of look we're more than happy to accept as the autumn winter comes on.
Yeah.
And the other issue Michael has with Phlomis tuberosa is the fact that it's making a takeover bid. So it's becoming quite vigorous, and it probably needs to be pulled in a bit.
Or, so, well, I mean, would you completely remove something? So I guess this is the thing. You can't predict what's going to happen, can you?
Well, not 100%. I mean, because plants will perform differently. Even in gardens next to each other, you're going to find that there will be different sort of ways that plants will grow. Obviously, this Phlomis has taken to this site more than one would have hoped.
Yes, with abandon.
With abandon. And because it goes into its decline rather too early, then probably what I would do, I wouldn't discard it altogether because I think it does have a use, but you would need to cull it on a regular basis, keep the colony down a little bit so that it doesn't take over too much land space. And it's in a couple of spots around the garden here, so maybe you could actually take out some of the colonies altogether, replace them with something else, and just keep it a little bit more restrained.
All right, good advice. Now, there is something right in front of us which you're going to have to get up for, but I want to talk about. Come on.
All right.
Now, this is dotted about everywhere. I don't think I've seen this before. Am I just blind and delusional?
Well, you just haven't been around enough, obviously. This is Caryopteris clandonensis, which is actually a shrub. It's not really a perennial. It does need cutting back in the winter because if you don't cut it back, it becomes somewhat leggy. So these have been cut quite hard each winter. And it comes out in high summer with these little gorgeous blue flowers and greyish foliage, and it's an absolute pollinator magnet, and a cat magnet apparently as well.
This is the pussycat that's come to say hello. It's been following us all day.
Yes, it's been here all day. Now you're famous, cat. So Caryopteris, again, it has nicely scented foliage, so it's in that sort of mint family of plants. So it has quite nice scented leaves, flowers for quite a good time during high summer. If it has a drawback, of course, it does look quite scruffy when it goes over. So it's not one of those plants that makes any real useful impact later in the autumn, winter. But in high summer, it's fabulous.
And who is loving it? The bees. Oh, my goodness.
Yes, they're absolutely covered in bees.
Yeah.
So obviously a plant you need to put near your veggie garden to attract pollinators, all that sort of thing.
And where's it from?
This comes from Central Europe. I have to say there's been a few selections made of it as well. There's slightly darker blue ones, and there's a maybe overdone gold-leafed one. I'm not sure about it. The gold and the blue actually work quite well together, but it might be a little over the top, one called Hints of Gold. So there are a range of Caryopteris that you can find. This one I think is basically the stock standard one, and it has lightly self-sown itself around as well.
Well, it's also lightly self-sown itself, and I'm going to cunningly move the camera.
The technology you go for.
It's astounding, isn't it? And I guess this brings up an interesting point, because both of us thought, what an artful placing right in the middle of a gravel path.
Yeah, and then Michael tells us it came up of its own accord.
Yes, which brings up that question about how far do you let things go? Which is really, I guess, a personal thing.
Of course it is. I
would
mean,
you weed the path or let this occur?
Yeah, and in this case it has been left to stay. And if Michael had been really smart about it, he would have said that it was a purposeful placing, because it actually does really work quite well. But yes, it's a big open gravel area. It cuts the area up a bit, and it would in fact be a personal taste thing as to whether you keep your open spaces as open as possible or allow nature to take its course a little bit.
I guess while we're here too, let's just give the viewers a bit of an understanding about the plants we're not going to spend a lot of time on but are here. So some other key things.
All right, well, there's some evergreen things around the place, like large mounds of semi-prostrate rosemary, which will give really good winter oomph with its form. And again, it'll be blue flowering when it's in flower. There are great big drifts of sedum. I'm assuming it's Matrona, might be autumn joy, but I think Matrona. And there's big drifts of that, so that's doing a great job. There are large colonies of Euphorbia caracias, which again is going to give winter interest. We did a...
I was going to say...
Yeah, I beat you. We did a video on euphorbias.
Which we will link below.
Yes, and so they are telling in the summer with their nice mounds of silver foliage, but of course they'll come out...
Telling, Stephen, are they telling?
Yes, they're very telling. Don't start. And of course their big heads of limey green flowers in the late winter make them a very useful early season event in the garden. And there's some lovely Achillea, which I assume is Achillea terracotta, and they've used bright yellow pokers in odd spots around the garden as well, which is quite lovely. And I actually do like the yellow ones. I mean, nothing wrong with an orange red hot poker, but there's something about the yellow ones I find particularly appealing. So they're, of course, known as Kniphoffias or Kniphophias or...
I've never known how to say it. Kniphofia.
Yeah, I would say Kniphofia because the K is silent. I'm not sure about who it was named after, but I've just got this sense that there will be silent letters in that word. So I would say Kniphofia. But I'm very happy to be corrected on that one because it's a little bit strange.
And there's a lovely row of asters over there.
Yes, there's some of that lovely late summer flowering asters which do make a fabulous show, and they're no longer asters either, but let's not go down that path, shall we?
No. But the path we shall go down and up is out of here, because let's go and look at the landscape that this garden is in, that Michael was talking about at the beginning.
Because it's completely
different.
It's almost an alien environment all within the one property. So
Let's go.
Really good. Whilst I've been walking around the garden here, something that sort of leapt out at me, which I find really intriguing. Most of the garden's got a sort of an expected palette of prairie-style plants, grasses and perennials and things. And lo and behold, in amongst it all is this Cussonia, which of course is a South African small tree. It looks fantastic, I have to say, but was it Michael who selected this, or was it the garden owners? I'm going to put my money on the garden owners on this one. And don't forget, funnily enough, we have done a video on this particular genus of plants, so we'll link it below so you can go in and have a look at some of the other Cussonias.
Well, it's interesting. We've just stepped out of the garden and you can immediately feel the wind.
Yes, exactly. The original sort of circle-ish thing of trees around the perennial garden has made a huge impact on the sort of environment within. So out here, we're out in the open where we can look for hundreds of kilometres virtually. In there, you're in a special space.
Michael did allude to the ring of trees. So what are the species that were around here originally?
All right, well, it's a very mixed bag, I have to say. There's a number of eucalyptus, some of which aren't locally native eucalypts, so they've been planted. There are maples, there are birches, there's a whole range of things. There's a golden ash. I mean, the selection of trees is really interesting because it's obvious that the previous owners were just planting trees, so it's all serendipitous. But instead of having that really sort of formalised outskirts to a garden, which a lot of people do, so they'll plant a row of the same tree or plant a hedge around it to give it that sense of surrounds, this is a really more amorphous sort of edging to the garden, and I think it actually works better for being that, in fact.
It's beautiful. All right, well, we're kind of getting out a little bit, but let's go right into the landscape now.
All right, good.
Edging further out of the garden, we can see the rock that Michael was referring to very close to the surface.
Well, in fact, on the surface now, because they've taken the soil off it and it's actually become part of the landscape. So you've got this wonderful rock reef that almost circles this part of the house, and you've got the very stark walls of the house.
Yeah.
So you can see why the garden that we've just been in wouldn't really work around this sort of setting.
No. All right, let's edge further out into the wild landscape.
Yes, let's do that.
And so here we are on the edge of the veranda, looking out.
To infinity, virtually. It goes on and on and on. And so it's dramatic.
And it's interesting because that whole notion of the borrowed landscape, where
Yep.
you've got something like this, and Australia has particular colours too. This colour is so typical of our environment that how do you garden if you had sort of bright colours here and then
yes.
all of that out there? There's this weird lawn machine, lawnmower, robotic lawnmower that's following us around.
Yes, I'm a bit freaked out, but anyhow, there you go.
Right behind you anyway.
Yeah.
So that's Michael's point. He felt that you'd have to landscape the whole thing,
Yeah.
or you just contain it.
Yes, exactly. So by creating a contained garden that's actually not connected to the house is the only way where you can have flowers and foliage and things that are intimate, and it works wonderfully well. I mean, this grand landscape out here, you don't want to tamper with.
No, and you don't want to sort of pull focus from it because you do want to absorb it all, and it stretches forever, doesn't it?
Yes, you'd need to landscape the top of that hill over there if it was going to work, I think, but there you go.
Excellent. Well, this has been a wonderful journey. So many thanks to the generous owners of this house. And remember, if you're watching this in time, this weekend, the garden is open for a fundraiser. So do come along and enjoy it as we have done.
Yes.
And many thanks to Michael McCoy as well for his time. We'll put the links to his books and TV programs below.
And don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the alert button so that you can keep up with our adventures wherever we're going each week. And of course, our Monday shorts.
Yes, so who knows what we'll be doing next week. It will be something fabulous, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Bye all.